Ho ho ho! Happy holidays everybody! It's my last video of the year and I thought what better time to return to map making and make a frosty winter themed map for my Patreon. If you didn't know, over on my Patreon at the $10 tier you get access to a collaborative world that we've been building. Over the last couple of months I've been posting polls asking the folks there different details about this world, and we're finally at the stage to start refining the map. So today I'm going to make the map for that process and show you my approach for making a more Arctic frigid themed map in Wonderdraft. As we go through the process, I'm going to be using today's sponsor Describe to fill out some of the details. Describe make really cool box text information, and I'll show more of that later in the video. To start with, I opened up my world map over in Wonderdraft and I used the create detail map to pull up a section of my existing map and make a new map from that. I blocked in some basic color and laid down some really basic mountains following the path of the islands just to get a rough sense for where things would be. I used the spray tool in the stamp section of Wonderdraft to try and fill out some of that region, get a sense of how many mountains I want, what will look good on the map. But then when I zoomed in, I realized that this detail map that I'd created really just wasn't high enough resolution for me. So what I did was I exported a copy of that map and then loaded that back in on a 4K canvas and then traced around the outline of the coasts to give me my new base map. This is a really quick way to up the detail level of your zoomed in maps. Just take your ref map, import it as an image, lower that opacity and just trace around it. I do this really frequently, export a map, load it into a new higher resolution canvas and just trace around the outlines. It's really useful, especially when you don't want to retain any of the fine detail like mountains or trees or anything like that and you just want the outline. Once I had imported this image, I traced all the way around it with a really high roughness brush to get that craggly detailed coastline. You can see here that I left that southern area, that tip of the continent below, with really smooth coastlines and no detail. This is to just give a visual representation that there is land there, but that's not the focus of this map. It helps draw the eye to the regions of the map that we're focused on. This is another thing that I do really frequently when I'm making maps that cover more than one nation. Any nation that's not the focus of the map, I leave in ultra low detail and just paint over it with a block color so that you can see its relationship in distance and size to the map and the region that you're talking about, but so that it doesn't draw your eye. Next, I went in and did even more coastline refinement. I increased the size of my brush tool to give me an even bigger and more random pattern of craggles and squiggles all along the coast, and I followed around each of the islands until I had something that looked somewhat natural. I did do some more refinements going forward, but that gave me a good starting point. Once my coastline was sorted, it was time to start blocking in the mountains. The way I do this is I start with my largest mountains, the highest points of my map, and I lay those down. When it came to the general direction of my mountains, I knew I wanted to follow the path of the island chain. Because these are islands, that is kind of how they would form. The mountains would follow along that path rather than run perpendicular. In my previous videos on making fantasy maps, I've talked a lot about plate tectonics. You can see some of that in this playlist up here. But as this region doesn't sit on the meeting point between two plates, I didn't need to consider that. So instead, I just followed the island path with those mountains. So I started with my largest mountains, then reduced my brush size to kind of fill out the section, make a range that's a little bit thicker. And then I switched to an even smaller stamp size and switched over to the spray option, which applies a whole bunch of mountains or stamps all at once, all kind of in a region. And I use that to fill out the exterior of the mountain range. And then I vastly increased the size of that spray brush and used it to add in hills all across the landscape just to make some texture on my map so that the vast tundra regions aren't just plain flat pieces of map. Next, it was time to start adding the trees and forest, and to do this, I started by looking at my climate map and figuring out where my prevailing winds would be, so I could figure out where my rain shadows would be. So when the winds come in off of the sea, they will usually hit a mountain, and the opposite side of that mountain tends to have less vegetation. It tends to be drier than the side facing the coastline. So I used that information, used my climate map to figure out that the northwesterly side of all of the mountain ranges would have the majority of the forests, and then that opposing side of the mountains would be much more bare, unless there was other circumstances like a river or a lake. Doing this allows me to place forests pretty consistently, fairly realistically, without having to spend a huge heap of time on it. Next, I started adding rivers and lakes and started adding trees and forested areas around those bodies of water where the ground wouldn't be as frozen, where it would be more fertile. And once I'd done that, I started shading all of those areas. So I took a slightly darker color, shaded in the mountain region, shaded underneath all of the forest, just to give them some separation from the main map. Then I took a step back and had a look at the map, and it was looking pretty bare in a lot of places. I'd done the major mountain ranges, but between them was pretty barren. So I went in with that stamp tool again, added a couple of smaller mountain ranges just to add some more visual interest to the map. This isn't necessarily following any realistic ideals of where the mountains would be. I was doing this purely from an artistic point of view, looking at the map and thinking where looks bare and where needs some visual interest. Because that's an important thing to think about when you're making these maps is, yes, you might want it to be realistic, but it also does need to serve to be visually interesting and be a piece of art in its own right. So I like to fill in some of the gaps and not make it look so barren. Then I started working on the ground color. I took a green brush and I went all around the coastline, representing some of that thawing of the snow and ice as it meets the sea, and some of the more rich and lush areas around the coastline. I did this along the rivers and the lakes as well. And then I worked in successively lighter layers of greys up to white to paint in the tundra, to make it look as though as you pull away from the mountains and the coastline, the further into the heartland of this territory you get, the colder it gets, the more icy it gets, and therefore the brighter white the map gets. It was at this point that I realized that I hadn't actually added any fjords. So I went back in and started adding them using the craggles created by my rugged brush tool right at the start to inform me. Anytime the land curved inwards a little bit, I took that to be where a fjord would be and just pulled in away from the coast, making those finger-like little pieces of land that stick out in the classic fjord look. I focused mainly on the ocean-facing coastline and not on the coastline facing other islands for this. This is something I've broadly observed in real-world cases of fjords. I have no idea why. I suspect it might be something to do with the more rapid motion or the more aggressive movement of the tide when you're facing out to the open ocean versus a kind of a sheltered section that's sheltered by another piece of land, but I'm not 100% sure. It's just something I noticed, so I added it to the map. Then I went in and added forests to all the fjords. So when I think of a fjord, I think of a valley covered in trees that go almost right to the waterline. So I went in, and for the majority of where I'd added all the fjords, I went in and added more trees, more vegetation, and that really helped fill out the edges of all the islands. The center had kind of been filled out by the mountains and the hills, and this really helped kind of tie it together and fill in some of those outer edges. And finally, I went in and painted the mountains. So similarly to how I went with the tundras, I started with a kind of semi-dark grey tone and then worked my way up to an almost pure white, throwing in a little bit of blue cool tones in there to give that icy feel and make it feel like the centers of these mountain ranges were higher and colder than the surround. Once I'd done that, I loaded the map up into Legend Keeper and got to work on some of the general details for this world. Now, I have a map of my world that shows where all the prevailing winds and ocean currents are, and that's something I'm going to make a video on in the new year, but I used that to inform me of where I should place some of the details in this new region of my world. So I could see that in this section of the world, the prevailing winds blew in one direction, so I could place the ports in such a way that it would make sense for ships trying to travel from the north to the south, where they would arrive if they were following the winds. And then I could also use the information of my currents to see where ports needed to be placed, what side of the islands they needed to be placed on if someone wanted to follow the current instead of the wind. Little details like this are one of the reasons why I love adding so much detail on the world stage of map making. Adding trade winds and currents really isn't necessary when it comes to running an RPG, But as I did here, you can use it to take some of that work away from you. I didn't need to think about, okay, where are the predominant cities going to be in this region on these islands, because this is an island nation. So ocean-based trade is going to be their principal economic boon. So it's going to be port cities. All their major cities are going to be ports. Where are the ports going to be placed? I just need to look at where the wind comes and where the current comes and how they would actually navigate the sea to place the ports. It took away all of the kind of decisions away from me and places them in a really realistic way that works for the lore of the world. Once I finished adding all the ports to my world, I wanted to add some more details, and to do that I used today's sponsor, Describe. Describe has thousands of pre-written text boxes, much like you would find in officially published modules, and you can use them to add all kinds of details to your world. For my particular purposes today, I loaded up their Arctic tag, searched for anything related to Arctic adventures or areas, characters, anything with a kind of winter theme to it, and I just scrolled through it until I found something to inspire me. It wasn't long before I found several elements that I thought could work really, really well. The first of which was a white dragon lair and a burned city, one that had been burnt by a dragon. Now, when I was polling my patrons to decide what the governments of these different islands was going to be, the results for one of the islands was that it was going to be a theocracy, a religious-based island. And I thought that would pair really well with this dragon prompt from Describe, if this island was ruled by some dragon worshipping religious folk. Taking that one step further, I dived into the archives of the channel and found an encounter I had made for a frozen city involving a dragon named Vadazar, and I decided that I would pull that dragon from that encounter and place him on this island. So with the combination of Describe providing the inspiration for the location, my patrons describing the inspiration for the ruling class of this particular island, and the archives of the channel, I was able to create something that fit really nicely in my world. Some other details I pulled from the Describe descriptions was a ship frozen in ice. I think I'm going to turn that into some kind of tavern, and the Valley of Ice and Darkness. This is a really evocative name, and I decided to put it in one of the mountainous regions, and I'm really looking forward to developing that into something really sinister and threatening. Many of the descriptions on Describe have been written by Wizards of the Coast alumni, and you can get hundreds of them for free. But you can unlock thousands more with a monthly subscription. You can even tailor your subscription based on the kinds of text boxes that you want, whether you're a player or a GM. Check out Describe via the link in the description below, and a huge thank you to them for continuing to support the channel. So with all of those details added, here is my finished map. I'm really proud of this. I think the color palette evokes those cool, chilly vibes that you want from a winter themed map. I'm really pleased with how interesting the coastline looks, and I'm really excited to see what me and my patrons are able to come up with together as we continue to build this world. If you'd like to get involved with this collaborative world building project, head over to my Patreon. It's linked down in the description below, and I'd love to know what you think of this map down in the comments. I hope you have a wonderful festive period and a happy new year, and I shall see you in 2022. But until then, happy gaming.